My hands trembled as I applied lipstick for the third time, the coral shade catching the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom window. 67 years old, and here I was, nervous as a teenager before her first dance. The mirror reflected a woman I sometimes didn't recognize, silver hair styled in a soft bob, laugh lines mapping decades of joy and sorrow, eyes still bright but carrying the weight of accumulated seasons. "You're being ridiculous, Margaret," I whispered to my reflection, but my voice betrayed me with its slight quiver. The high school reunion invitation had sat on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I finally RSVP'd yes. 49 years since graduation. 49 years since I'd seen most of those faces, since I'd walked those hallways, since everything changed. I smoothed my navy dress, not too formal, not too casual, purchased specifically for this evening, after trying on half my closet and declaring everything either frumpy or trying too hard. My daughter Sarah had laughed when I called her in a panic yesterday. "Mom, you look beautiful in everything. Just go and have fun." Easy for her to say. She hadn't left her hometown carrying secrets that felt heavier with each passing year. The community center parking lot was fuller than I'd expected when I pulled in at 6:15. Cars from different decades sat side by side, their owners somewhere inside, probably having the same nervous conversations I was having with myself. I sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching other alumni walk toward the entrance. Some moved with the careful gait of age, others bounded forward with surprising energy. A few I almost recognized, the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of a head, but time had been both kind and cruel, blurring the sharp edges of memory. The registration table was staffed by Martha Henderson, now Martha Kowalski according to her name tag, who had been student council president and still carried herself with that same confident air. Her embrace was warm but brief, and she handed me a name tag with my yearbook photo. God, had I ever been that young? And a schedule of activities. "Margaret Chen, I can't believe it. You look wonderful." Martha's voice carried that slightly forced enthusiasm of someone working to place a face with a name. "I remember you were so involved in drama club. Are you still acting?" "Teaching, actually. Retired last year from Roosevelt Elementary. I didn't correct the name confusion. I'd been Margaret Sullivan then, before marriage, before divorce, before I'd reclaimed pieces of myself I'd thought were lost forever." The gymnasium had been transformed with round tables draped in our school colors, blue and gold, though the decorations couldn't quite mask the familiar scent of floor wax and decades of basketball games. A DJ played songs from our era, the Beatles, the Supremes, Bob Dylan, each melody a time machine, transporting me back to late-night studying, stolen kisses in hallways, dreams that seemed as vast as the ocean. I found my assigned table and recognized immediately the seating arrangement's cruel irony. James Morrison's name card sat directly across from mine. James, who had been my everything senior year until that April morning when everything shattered. James, who I hadn't spoken to since graduation, who had married Linda Patterson 2 months after we graduated, who had lived in this same town while I'd fled to California. My stomach churned as I took my seat, hyper-aware of every person who approached our table. Would he show up? Part of me hoped he wouldn't. Seeing him would mean confronting 49 years of what-ifs and carefully buried pain. But another part, the part that still remembered the weight of his hand in mine, desperately wanted to see what time had made of the boy who once promised me forever. "Margaret Sullivan! My God, is that really you?" I turned to find Carol Fleming, now Carol Martinez, approaching with arms outstretched. We'd been close friends junior year, though we drifted apart senior year when my world became complicated. Her hug was fierce and genuine, and for a moment I felt 17 again. "I heard you moved to California right after graduation," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "Teaching," Martha said. "I became a nurse, worked in pediatrics for 35 years. 2 kids, 4 grandkids. You? 1 daughter, Sarah. She's a doctor in San Francisco. 2 beautiful granddaughters. I pulled out my phone to show pictures, grateful for the familiar ritual of grandmother pride. What about James? Is he... I let the question hang in the air, not quite brave enough to complete it. Carol's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. Oh, honey, you didn't hear? Linda passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. James, he's had a rough time of it. They never had kids, you know. I think he's here somewhere tonight. The news hit me like a physical blow. Linda, dead. James, alone. The careful narrative I'd constructed about their perfect small-town life, the story that had helped me justify leaving, that had made my exile feel like the right choice, crumbled in an instant. I'd imagined them happy, surrounded by children and grandchildren, their love story, the one that should have been mine. I should warn you, Carol continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, there might be some drama tonight. You remember Tommy Kellerman? He's been telling anyone who'll listen that he has some big revelation about senior year. Something about secrets coming out at the reunion. You know how he always was, loved being the center of attention. Before I could respond, a familiar voice spoke my name. I looked up, and time collapsed. James Morrison stood beside our table, older certainly, his dark hair now silver white, his face lined with years I hadn't shared, but his eyes were the same deep brown that had once made me believe in forever. He wore a simple gray suit and a nervous smile that reminded me achingly of the boy who used to wait by my locker every morning. James. The word came out barely above a whisper. Carol muttered something about finding the ladies' room and disappeared, leaving us alone in a gymnasium full of people. You, he started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made my chest tight. You look beautiful, Maggie. No one had called me Maggie in decades. The nickname fell between us like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples across 49 years of silence. I'm sorry about Linda, I said, because it seemed important to acknowledge her first, to respect the life he'd built after I'd left. Carol just told me. His face clouded. Thank you. She was a good woman. We had a good life together. There was something in his tone, a careful emphasis on good, that made me wonder what he wasn't saying. May I? He gestured to the empty chair beside me, Linda's chair, according to the name card still sitting there. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He sat down, and suddenly I was overwhelmed by the nearness of him. The scent of his aftershave, different but somehow still familiar. The way he folded his hands on the table, the small scar on his knuckle from when he'd helped his father repair their fence the summer before senior year. I never thought you'd come back, he said quietly, his eyes searching my face as if trying to reconcile the woman I'd become with the girl he'd known. After graduation, when you left for California, I thought... You thought what? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, edged with 49 years of wondering why he'd never tried to find me, never called, never written. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the couples on the small dance floor swaying to the way you look tonight. Finally, he said, I thought you'd made your choice. That morning, when you wouldn't see me, when your parents said you'd already left for California, I thought you'd decided we were a mistake. The gymnasium noise faded to a distant hum. That morning, he was talking about that terrible April morning when my world had exploded and I'd been too ashamed, too terrified, too heartbroken to face him. The morning my parents had driven me to my aunt's house in Sacramento, leaving behind everything I thought I wanted, including him. James, I started, but was interrupted by the DJ's voice echoing through the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special presentation tonight. Tommy Kellerman has some memories to share from our senior year. My blood turned to ice. Beside me, James went very still. Across the room, I could see Tommy approaching the microphone, his face flushed with what looked like alcohol and excitement. He'd always been a troublemaker, but something about his expression tonight suggested this was different. This was dangerous. "Oh, God," I whispered, my hands beginning to shake. "James, I need to tell you something about that morning, about why I left." Before he— "I know," James said quietly, his hand covering mine on the table. His touch was warm, steady, real. "Maggie, I've known for 49 years. I've been waiting 49 years to tell you it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except that you were gone." The world tilted on its axis. James knew. He'd known all along, and he was touching my hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, like 49 years hadn't passed, like we were still those two kids who'd believed love could conquer anything. "You knew?" My voice cracked on the words. The secret I'd carried all these years, the shame that had driven me away, the reason I'd convinced myself he was better off without me. He'd known. His thumb traced gentle circles on my knuckle, a gesture so tender it made my eyes fill with tears. "Your friend Jenny Michaels told me a few weeks later. She thought I had a right to know why you'd really left, said you were protecting me but breaking your own heart in the process." Jenny, sweet Jenny, who'd been my confidant, who'd held my hand through those terrifying weeks before I left town. I'd lost touch with her years ago, but apparently she'd understood better than I had what love really meant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tommy's voice boomed through the speakers, drawing our attention back to the front of the room. He swayed slightly at the microphone, clearly having enjoyed the open bar. "I've got some stories to share tonight about our graduating class, some truths that have been buried too long." My heart hammered against my ribs. James's grip on my hand tightened, and I could see the tension in his jaw. Around us, conversation gradually died as people turned their attention to the makeshift stage. "You see, I've been doing some research," Tommy continued, his words slightly slurred. "Going through old yearbooks, talking to people, and I discovered that our perfect little class of 75 had some secrets, some real juicy secrets." "We should go," I whispered to James, starting to push back my chair. But he held my hand firmly, keeping me in place. "No," he said quietly. "Whatever he says, we face it together this time. I should have fought for you then, Maggie. I was 18 and stupid and scared, but I should have come after you. I'm not running away from this anymore." Tommy cleared his throat dramatically. "For instance, did you know that Margaret Sullivan, that's Margaret Chin now, left town because she was pregnant? Knocked up by some college boy she met at a party, from what I heard. Always thought she was so pure and innocent, didn't you? But she was just a—" "That's enough." James's voice cut through the gymnasium like a blade. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and the sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Every eye in the room was on our table now, and I felt my face burn with humiliation. But James wasn't finished. He walked toward the front of the room with steady, measured steps, and I watched in amazement as the boy I'd once loved became a man defending my honor 4 decades too late. "Tommy, you always were a gossip and a bully," James said, his voice carrying clearly without the microphone. "And you're still getting your facts wrong. Margaret Sullivan was pregnant when she left town, that's true, but the baby was mine." A collective gasp rippled through the room. I sat frozen, tears streaming down my face, as James continued speaking to the stunned crowd. We were 17 years old and scared out of our minds. Her parents sent her away to protect both of us from the scandal, and I let them because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I was protecting her reputation, her future. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I wasn't wrong about loving her. He turned to look directly at me across the room. I wasn't wrong about that. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not everyone. I could see some disapproving faces, some whispered conversations, but enough. Carol appeared beside me, her arm around my shoulders, and I realized I wasn't alone in this moment of terrible, beautiful exposure. James walked back to our table, ignoring Tommy's sputtered protests and the DJ's attempts to restore normalcy with music. He sat down beside me and took both my hands in his. "So," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine, "do you want to tell me about our child? Because I've wondered every single day for 49 years. I couldn't speak. The words were there. Sarah, beautiful Sarah, with his eyes and my stubborn chin. Sarah, who had grown up to be everything I'd dreamed. But my throat was closed with emotion. Instead, I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and showed him the photo I'd shown Carol earlier. "This is Sarah," I managed to whisper, "and these are your granddaughters, Emma and Grace." James stared at the photo for a long time, his face cycling through expressions I couldn't read. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She has your smile," he said, "and your stubbornness, if the set of her jaw is anything to judge by. What does she do?" "She's a pediatric surgeon in San Francisco, married to a wonderful man named David. They have a good life, James, a really good life." "Does she know about me?" This was the question I dreaded. "She knows her father was someone I loved very much in high school, someone I lost touch with. She's never pushed for details, but I think she'd like to meet you if you're interested." James leaned back in his chair, running both hands through his hair. Around us, the reunion continued, but it felt like we were in a bubble, separate from the music and laughter and carefully avoided glances from our former classmates. "Interested," he repeated softly. "Maggie, I've missed 49 years of her life. I've missed watching you become a mother, missed being there when you needed me. I've missed everything that mattered." "But we're here now," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "We're both here now." He looked at me then with an expression that was achingly familiar, the same look he'd given me the night of junior prom, when we'd slow danced to Color My World, and he'd whispered that he loved me for the first time. Hope mixed with fear, tenderness shadowed by uncertainty. "What are you saying, Maggie?" I thought about Linda, about the life he'd built without me, about the decades of careful distance I'd maintained to protect us both from exactly this moment. I thought about my empty house in Sacramento, about the retirement years I'd planned to spend alone, about all the reasons why this was complicated and impractical and potentially heartbreaking. Then I thought about his hand on mine, about the way he'd stood up to defend me when it mattered, about the fact that some love stories don't follow conventional timelines. "I'm saying maybe it's not too late," I said. "Maybe we get a second chance at this." The rest of the reunion passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances, but I barely noticed. James and I spent the evening sharing 49 years of life in fragments. His work as a high school history teacher, my classroom full of second graders, his quiet marriage to Linda, and the way they'd built a comfortable life without passion, my divorce from Robert when Sarah was 12, and the realization that I'd married him because he was safe, not because I loved him. We danced to Unchained Melody, his arms around me feeling both foreign and familiar. And I marveled at how our bodies still moved together despite the decades and the changes. His wedding ring was gone, I noticed, though the pale band of skin remained. When I mentioned it, he said quietly, "I took it off 6 months ago. Linda told me to, actually, before she died. Said I'd carried enough guilt for both of us." Guilt about what? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "She knew I never stopped loving you." She knew she was second choice from the very beginning. We were kind to each other, Maggie, but we were never what you and I were. The admission hung between us like a bridge, connecting the past to this impossible present. When the DJ announced the last dance, neither of us wanted to break the spell by leaving, so we swayed together through the way you look tonight again, my head on his shoulder, his cheek against my hair. "Come home with me," he said as the music ended, and my heart stopped. "James, I don't think." "Not like that," he said quickly, his face flushing. "I mean, not unless... God, I'm making a mess of this. I just meant, come see the house. I'd like to show you the garden Linda and I built. I'd like to make you coffee and hear more about Sarah. I'd like to pretend for a few more hours that the last 49 years didn't happen." I studied his face in the dim light of the transformed gymnasium. He looked nervous, hopeful, younger somehow than he had when I'd first seen him tonight. This man who had been my first love, who had let me go because he thought it was right, who had just publicly claimed our daughter in front of half our graduating class. "Okay," I said simply. "I'd like that." His house was a modest 2-story on Maple Street, the same street where his parents had lived when we were teenagers. The garden was beautiful, roses and lavender, a small vegetable plot, a wooden bench positioned to catch the morning sun. It felt peaceful, cared for, like a place where two people had built something lasting, even without great passion. "Linda loved the flowers," he said, leading me up the front steps. "I kept everything exactly the way she had it. Seemed like the right thing to do." Inside, the house was clean, but felt oddly impersonal, as if whoever lived there had been careful not to leave too much of themselves behind. Family photos lined the mantel, but they were formal pictures, holiday gatherings, anniversaries, the kind of images that documented a life without revealing its emotional texture. James made coffee while I wandered the living room, studying the evidence of the years I'd missed. There was a photo of him and Linda on their wedding day, both looking young and tentative. Pictures from various anniversaries, their faces aging gradually, smiles becoming more practiced. But nowhere did I see the kind of candid shots that filled my own home, moments of genuine joy caught off guard, laughter that couldn't be posed. "She was lovely," I said when he returned with 2 steaming mugs. "She was," he agreed, settling beside me on the couch. "She deserved better than I gave her, though she never complained. She knew about you from the beginning. I told her before we got engaged that I'd loved someone else, that I'd lost her. Linda said she'd rather have part of me than none of me at all." The coffee was strong and bitter, like the emotions churning in my chest. "That must have been hard for both of you." "We made it work. We were companions more than lovers, especially after the first few years. We traveled some, had dinner with her sister's family on Sundays, went to church together. It was a good life, Maggie, just not the life I'd dreamed of when I was 18. I set my mug on the coffee table and turned to face him fully. "James, what are we doing? This is crazy. I live in California, you live here. We're both in our 60s with complicated histories and grown-up lives. We can't just pick up where we left off." He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee. Then he looked up at me with those same brown eyes that had captivated me at 17. "Why not?" he asked simply. "I'm retired as of last month. You said you retired last year. My house is paid off. Linda left me financially comfortable. You probably have a pension, some savings. We're both healthy. We're both alone." Our daughter is grown and successful. He paused, reaching for my hand. And I still love you, Maggie. I never stopped loving you. The words hit me like a physical force. I stared at our joined hands, his still strong despite the age spots, mine soft from years of teaching and gardening, and tried to process the impossibility of this moment. I love you too, I whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep in my chest. I've loved you for 49 years, James, even when I was married to Robert, even when I convinced myself I'd moved on, even when I thought I'd never see you again. But love isn't always enough, is it? We learned that the hard way. Maybe, he said, or maybe we were too young then to fight for what we wanted. Maybe we let other people make our choices for us. But we're not 18 anymore, Maggie. We get to decide what matters now. I thought about my neat little house in Sacramento, my routine of morning walks and evening reading, my quiet retirement plan of travel and volunteering. Then I thought about waking up beside this man, about learning his daily rhythms after all these years, about the messy, complicated, potentially heartbreaking prospect of building a life together at 67. Sarah, I said suddenly, I need to talk to Sarah first. She needs to know about you, about all of this, before we make any decisions. James nodded. Of course. And I'd like to meet her, if she's willing. I'd like to meet my granddaughters, too, though I understand if that takes time. It will take time, I said. All of this will take time. We're not the same people we were, James. We've both been shaped by 49 years of different experiences, different choices. We don't really know each other anymore. Then we'll learn, he said simply. We'll take it slow. We'll figure it out as we go. I'm not asking you to move in tomorrow, Maggie. I'm just asking you not to disappear again. Give us a chance to see what this could be. I looked around the living room where he'd spent decades with another woman, where he'd built a careful, controlled life in the absence of the one he'd really wanted. The idea of starting over at our age should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing I'd considered in years. I fly back to California on Tuesday, I said. I need time to think, to talk to Sarah, to figure out what this would even look like practically. And I need time to figure out how to tell people I'm in love with someone I haven't seen in 49 years, he said with a rueful laugh, though I suppose half our graduating class already knows now, thanks to Tommy's big mouth. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and processing the magnitude of what had happened tonight. Finally, I looked at my watch and realized it was nearly midnight. I should go, I said reluctantly. It's been a long night, and I have a feeling tomorrow's going to be even longer. He walked me to the door, and we stood there awkwardly for a moment, both of us clearly thinking about the goodbye we'd never gotten to say all those years ago. Maggie, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, before you go, what was she like as a baby, Sarah? What was I missing in those early years? My heart broke a little at the longing in his voice. She was perfect, I whispered. 10 fingers, 10 toes, your eyes, and the strongest will I've ever encountered. She never cried at night, but she sang to herself in her crib for hours. She walked at 9 months and started talking at 10 months, full sentences by her first birthday. She was brilliant and stubborn and beautiful, James. She was everything I'd hoped she'd be. Tears were streaming down both our faces now. He reached up to touch my cheek, his thumb brushing away the moisture there. I should have been there, he said. I should have found a way to be there for both of you. We survived, I said. We more than survived. Sarah had a good childhood, James. She was loved and supported and encouraged to be everything she wanted to be. She doesn't carry any anger about not knowing you. If anything, I think she's curious." He leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture so tender it took my breath away. "Call me when you get to California," he said. "Call me when you've talked to Sarah. Call me even if you decide this is too crazy and complicated. Just call me, please." "I will," I promised, and meant it. As I drove back to my hotel, I caught myself smiling in the rearview mirror. For the first time in decades, I had no idea what came next, and instead of terrifying me, it felt like a gift. The flight back to Sacramento gave me 5 hours to think, which turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. By the time we were descending into California, I'd mentally rehearsed a dozen different conversations with Sarah, imagined 50 different scenarios for how this could play out, and convinced myself alternately that I was making the biggest mistake of my life and that I was finally making the right choice. Sarah was waiting for me at baggage claim, looking polished and professional, even in jeans and a casual sweater. At 38, she had grown into her features. The stubborn chin I'd passed down, the serious brown eyes she'd inherited from James, the determined set of her shoulders that was purely her own creation. Watching her scan the crowd for me, I was struck by how much she looked like her father had at her age, though she'd never know to make that comparison. "Mom," she waved me over with a smile that lit up her face. "How was the reunion? Did you have fun reconnecting with old friends?" If she only knew. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and the faint antiseptic smell that always clung to her from the hospital. My daughter, my brilliant, accomplished daughter, who had never known she was missing half her history. "It was eventful," I said carefully as we walked toward the exit. "Actually, honey, I need to talk to you about something important. Would you mind coming to the house for a while?" Something in my tone must have alerted her because her smile faded slightly. "Mom, is everything okay? You look, I don't know, different, shaken up." "I'm fine," I assured her quickly. "Better than fine, actually. It's just that something happened at the reunion, something I need to tell you about, something I should have told you a long time ago." The drive to my house was filled with Sarah's questions. Was I sick? Had something happened at the reunion? Was I in some kind of trouble? All of which I deflected with promises to explain everything once we were home. By the time we pulled into my driveway, she was clearly worried and frustrated, which made what I had to tell her even more difficult. I made tea, mostly to have something to do with my hands, while Sarah sat at my kitchen table watching me with the patient expression she'd perfected during her medical training. It was the look she probably used with anxious parents, calm and reassuring, and designed to encourage honesty. "Okay, Mom," she said when I finally sat down across from her. "What's going on? You're making me nervous." I took a deep breath and looked at my daughter, really looked at her, noting all the ways she resembled the man she'd never met, all the gestures and expressions that had come from him. Then I started at the beginning. "When I was 17, I fell in love with a boy named James Morrison," I said. "We dated for almost 2 years, and we were planning to get married after graduation. But in April of our senior year, I found out I was pregnant." Sarah went very still. Her tea mug froze halfway to her lips, and I watched her mind process the implications of what I'd just said. "Pregnant," she repeated carefully. "With me? With you." I reached across the table to take her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "Sarah, honey, I know I've always told you that your father was someone I dated briefly in college, someone who wasn't ready for responsibility. That wasn't true. James Morrison is your biological father, and he was ready for responsibility. We both were, in our naive 17-year-old way." "Then why?" Sarah's voice trailed off, but her eyes were sharp with questions. "Because it was 1975, and I was 17 years old and pregnant in a small town where that mattered. My parents were horrified by the scandal. They were convinced it would ruin both our futures, that we'd end up trapped in minimum wage jobs with a baby we couldn't support. So they sent me away to live with my aunt in California until you were born." Sarah set down her mug with careful precision. "And James, did he know?" "He knew I was pregnant. He wanted to marry me, wanted us to keep the baby and figure it out together. But my parents convinced me that the kind thing to do was let him go. Let him have the future they thought he deserved. So I left without saying goodbye." For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. She stared at her hands, and I could practically see her reorganizing 38 years of understanding about herself and her history. "Is he still alive?" she asked finally. "Yes, he lives in our old hometown. He was at the reunion on Saturday night." Sarah's head snapped up. "You saw him? You talked to him?" "I talked to him. Sarah, he's wanted to know about you for 49 years. When I showed him your picture, when I told him what you'd accomplished, he cried." My daughter was quiet for another long moment, processing. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before? Why let me think my father was some random college guy who didn't care?" The hurt in her voice was worse than anger would have been. I'd spent her entire life protecting her from rejection that might never have come, and in doing so, I'd deprived her of a relationship with a man who might have loved her as much as I did. "Because I was scared," I said honestly. "Scared that he'd moved on completely, that he wouldn't want to be reminded of me and the choice we'd made. Scared that he'd reject you, and I couldn't bear the thought of you being hurt like that. And maybe, if I'm being completely honest, scared that if I opened that door, everything I'd built would fall apart." Sarah was quiet for so long I started to worry she was too angry to respond. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression that was part hurt, part confusion, and part something that might have been excitement. "What's he like?" she asked quietly. "Tell me about him." Relief flooded through me. She wasn't shutting down, wasn't too angry to hear more. "He's a retired high school history teacher. He was married to a woman named Linda for 45 years, but she passed away 3 years ago from cancer. They never had children together. He's kind and funny and still has the same gentle way about him that made me fall in love with him when I was 15. And Sarah, he has your eyes. Looking at him is like seeing you in masculine form 30 years from now." "Does he want to meet me?" The hope in her voice made my chest tight. "More than anything, but only if you're comfortable with it, only when you're ready. There's no pressure, honey. This doesn't have to change anything if you don't want it to." Sarah laughed, a sound that was half tears and half genuine amusement. "Mom, this changes everything. I have a father. I have a biological father who wanted me, who didn't abandon us, who's been wondering about me for almost 40 years. How could that not change everything?" She was right, of course. The revelation had shifted the foundation of her identity, just as seeing James again had shifted mine. We sat in my kitchen talking until well past dinner time, going over every detail I could remember about him, about our relationship, about the circumstances that had led to our separation. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as the evening light faded outside my windows. "With you and James, I mean. It's obvious there are still feelings there. I can see it in your face when you talk about him." Trust my perceptive daughter to cut straight to the heart of it. "I don't know," I admitted. "We're both different people than we were at 17. We've both lived entire lives without each other. The practical complications alone are staggering. He lives in Ohio. I live here. We're both set in our routines." "But," Sarah prompted, clearly hearing the unspoken continuation in my voice. "But I still love him," I said quietly. "I've loved him for 49 years, Sarah. Even when I was married to your stepfather, even when I convinced myself I'd moved on, part of me never stopped loving James Morrison." Sarah reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, the gesture so like something James had done 2 nights ago that it took my breath away. "Then maybe the practical complications don't matter as much as you think they do," she said. Mom, you're 67 years old. You've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people. Me, your students, even Robert during the divorce when he was falling apart. When do you get to do something just because it makes you happy? It's not that simple. Why isn't it? Sarah interrupted. You're both adults. You're both free to make your own choices. You've already raised your children, built your careers, done all the responsible things. If you want to be with him, be with him. And what if it doesn't work out? What if we're too different now? What if we can't bridge 49 years of separate lives? Sarah smiled, and for a moment I saw James in her expression, the same gentle confidence he'd had when we were young, the same quiet strength. Then you'll have tried. Mom, what if it does work out? What if you get a second chance at the love story you thought was over? Isn't that worth the risk? Before I could answer, my phone rang. James' number appeared on the screen, and my heart did the same stuttering dance it had been doing since Saturday night. That's him, I said unnecessarily. Answer it, Sarah said immediately. I want to hear his voice. My hand trembled as I accepted the call. Hello, James. Maggie. Even across 2,000 miles, his voice made me feel 17 again. I hope I'm not calling too late. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation, about everything that happened. Did you make it home safely? I did. James, I'm here with Sarah. I told her about you, about us. She knows everything now. The silence on the other end stretched for so long, I wondered if we'd lost the connection. Then James' voice came through, thick with emotion. She knows? How? How did she take it? I looked at my daughter, who was watching me with bright, curious eyes. Why don't you ask her yourself? Before I could lose my nerve, I handed the phone to Sarah. She took it with steady hands, though I could see the slight tremor in her fingers. Hello, she said, and then listened for a moment. Yes, this is Sarah. Yes, I can hear it too. The resemblance, I mean. My mom showed me pictures of you from high school, and it's remarkable. I watched my daughter have her first conversation with her father, noting the way her expression softened, the way she unconsciously mirrored his phone posture, leaning forward slightly, her free hand gesturing even though he couldn't see her. They talked for nearly an hour, Sarah asking careful questions about his life, his work, his memories of me at 17, James asking about her childhood, her career, her family. He wants to talk to you again, Sarah said finally, handing the phone back to me. Her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. James? Maggie, she's incredible. She sounds just like you did at that age, so serious and thoughtful, but with this underlying warmth. And she has my laugh. Did you know that? When she laughed at something I said, it was like hearing an echo of myself. My own eyes filled with tears. She wants to meet you, in person, I mean. She's talking about flying to Ohio next weekend if you're available. Available? James's voice cracked slightly. Maggie, I'd cancel anything to meet our daughter. But what about you? Are you thinking about what we discussed? I looked at Sarah, who was pretending not to eavesdrop while obviously hanging on every word. I'm thinking about a lot of things. Can I call you tomorrow after I've had time to process all of this? Of course. Maggie, thank you for telling her, for letting her call, for giving me this chance. I know it wasn't easy. After we hung up, Sarah and I sat in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, she said, "He sounds like a good man, Mom. Gentle, kind. I can see why you loved him." He is a good man. He always was. So what are you going to do? I thought about the question that had been churning in my mind since Saturday night. What was I going to do? I was 67 years old, with a comfortable retirement, a beautiful home, a routine I'd spent years perfecting. I had friends in Sacramento, a life I'd built carefully and deliberately. But I also had a second chance at a love I thought was lost forever. I think, I said slowly, I'm going to call the airline and see about changing my ticket to Ohio. I think maybe it's time to stop being practical and start being brave." Sarah's smile lit up the room. "Really? But first, I want you to meet your father. I want you two to have a chance to know each other without me hovering and projecting my own emotions onto every interaction. This relationship you're building with him, it's separate from what he and I might have. It's yours." "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for finally telling me the truth, for letting me have this chance to know him. Thank you for not hating me for keeping it from you for so long. Mom, you did what you thought was right at the time. We all make choices based on the information and wisdom we have in the moment. You were 17 and scared and trying to protect everyone you loved. I can't fault you for that." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the conversation I'd had with James, about the hope in Sarah's voice when she talked to him, about the impossible turn my life had taken in just 4 days. Saturday morning, I'd been a retired teacher with a quiet, predictable future. Now, I was contemplating uprooting my entire life for a man I hadn't seen in 49 years. But as I drifted off to sleep, I wasn't thinking about the practical complications or the risks involved. I was thinking about the way James had defended me in front of our entire graduating class, about the tenderness in his voice when he talked to Sarah, about the way his hand had felt holding mine after all these years. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe, at 67, it was finally time to stop being practical and start being happy. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, email exchanges, and increasingly frequent video chats. Sarah flew to Ohio the following weekend and spent 3 days with James, returning with stories and photos and a lightness in her expression I'd never seen before. They'd visited his school, walked through the neighborhood where he and I had grown up, spent hours talking about everything from his teaching career to her medical practice to their shared love of old movies and terrible puns. He cried when he saw Emma and Grace on video chat, Sarah told me, showing me pictures from her visit. They thought he was just Grandma Maggie's friend at first, but when I explained that he was their biological grandfather, Emma asked if that meant they had twice as many grandparents now. He laughed so hard he started crying again. Watching my daughter bond with her father from a distance was both wonderful and surreal. They had an easy rapport that felt natural despite the decades they'd missed, and I could see elements of James's personality in Sarah that I'd attributed to mysterious genetic luck. Her dry sense of humor, her methodical approach to problems, her tendency to gesture with her hands when she was excited, all inherited from a man she'd never known. James and I talked every day, sometimes for hours. We shared the details of our separate lives, his quiet marriage to Linda, my tumultuous divorce from Robert, the careers we'd built, the dreams we'd pursued, and the ones we'd abandoned. We talked about Sarah's childhood, about the moments he'd missed and the milestones I'd experienced alone. We talked about everything except the question that hung between us. What happened next? Finally, on a Thursday evening in early November, I couldn't avoid it any longer. "James," I said during our nightly call, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay." His voice was cautious, as if he sensed the weight of whatever was coming. "If I came to Ohio, if I sold my house and moved there to be with you, what would that look like? I mean, really, practically speaking." "Would I move in with you? Would we get married? Would we just date and see what happens? Because I'm 67 years old and I don't have time for ambiguity anymore." He was quiet for so long, I wondered if he'd hung up. Then he said, "Maggie, I want to marry you. I wanted to marry you 49 years ago, and I want to marry you now. But I also want you to be sure this is what you want, not just a romantic notion you'll regret when the reality sets in." "What reality?" I asked, though my heart was pounding at his words. The reality that I'm set in my ways after living alone for 3 years. The reality that you'd be leaving behind everything you've built in California. The reality that we're both older now, that we'll probably get on each other's nerves sometimes, that we might discover we're not as compatible as we remember being. I appreciated his honesty, even as it forced me to confront my own fears. And what if we discover we are as compatible as we remember? What if this works, James? What if we get to grow old together after all? Then he said softly, I'll be the luckiest man who ever lived. That weekend, I flew to Ohio, not for a reunion or a visit, but to see if I could imagine building a life there. James picked me up at the airport, and the sight of him waiting at the gate, casual in jeans and a blue sweater that matched his eyes, holding a bouquet of the yellow roses I'd loved at 17, made my decision for me. He showed me around his town with the enthusiasm of a real estate agent and the tenderness of a man in love. We visited the high school where he taught for 37 years, walked through the downtown that had been revitalized with antique shops and coffee houses, drove past the house where I'd grown up and found it painted a cheerful yellow with a swing set in the backyard. It's beautiful here, I said, as we sat on his back porch Saturday evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I'd forgotten how beautiful Ohio could be in the fall. But, he prompted, clearly hearing the hesitation in my voice. But it's not home anymore. I've been gone for 49 years, James. Everyone I knew has moved away or changed so much. We don't have anything in common anymore. Starting over here would mean starting completely over. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern on my knuckle. What if we started over somewhere else? Somewhere that would be new for both of us? I turned to look at him, surprised. You'd leave here? You've lived in this town your entire life. This town has memories of Linda, of the life we built together. Good memories, but memories of a different life than the one I want with you. Maybe it's time for both of us to try something completely new. We spent the next 2 days looking at real estate websites, dreaming about possibilities. A beach house in North Carolina, a small farm in Vermont, a condo in Portland with mountain views. Each option felt like a page from someone else's life, exciting and terrifying in equal measure. We're really going to do this, aren't we? I said Sunday night as we sat in his living room, laptops open to real estate listings, coffee growing cold on the side table. Do you want to do this? He asked seriously. Really, truly want to, not just think you should want to. I looked around his living room, at the evidence of the life he'd shared with Linda, at the careful, controlled existence he'd built in the absence of passion. Then I looked at him, this man who had loved me for 49 years, who had welcomed our daughter with open arms, who was willing to uproot his entire life for the chance to build something new with me. Yes, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. I want to do this. I want to try building a life with you, even if we're starting 49 years later than we planned. He kissed me then, the first real kiss we'd shared since high school, and it was both familiar and completely new. His lips were softer than I remembered, his hands more careful, but the feelings, the overwhelming sense of rightness, of coming home, were exactly the same. Where do you want to go? He asked when we broke apart, both of us breathing hard. I thought about the question seriously. Where did I want to spend the rest of my life with this man I'd loved for so long? What kind of adventure did I want our second chance to be? Somewhere warm, I said finally. Somewhere we can have a garden and walk on the beach and watch our granddaughters grow up. Somewhere that feels like a fresh start for both of us. North Carolina it is, he said, pulling me closer. We'll find a house with a big kitchen so Sarah and her family can visit. with enough bedrooms for Emma and Grace to stay whenever they want. We'll plant roses and vegetables and maybe get a dog." "A Dodd?" I laughed, remembering how he'd always wanted a golden retriever when we were teenagers. "Always wanted one," he said, grinning. "Linda was allergic." As I fell asleep in his guest ring that night, I marveled at the strange turns life could take. 4 weeks ago, I'd been a retired teacher with a quiet, predictable future. Now I was planning to sell my house, leave the only adult life I'd ever known, and move across the country to start over with my high school sweetheart. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like the first honest decision I'd made in decades. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house in Wilmington, North Carolina, watching James teach Emma and Grace how to make his famous chocolate chip pancakes. At 7 and 5, they had taken to their newly discovered grandfather with the easy acceptance of children, and he had embraced his role with enthusiasm that made my heart sing. "Grandpa James, you're putting in too many chocolate chips," Emma informed him seriously, her dark hair, so like Sarah's at that age, falling across her face as she studied the mixing bowl. "There's no such thing as too many chocolate chips," he replied solemnly, adding another handful to the batter. "It's scientifically impossible." Grace giggles and tried to sneak a chocolate chip from the bag, earning a gentle swat from James. "Those are for the pancakes, little thief." I watched this scene from the doorway, coffee mug at hand, marveling at how quickly we'd all adapted to this new normal. The girls had been skeptical at first. Another grandfather was confusing when they'd never known they were missing one. But James had won them over with patience, terrible jokes, and a seemingly endless supply of chocolate chip pancakes. Sarah and David were in the living room, reading the Sunday paper and arguing good-naturedly about weekend plans. They'd flown out for the housewarming party we'd thrown last weekend, but had decided to extend their stay when David managed to take a few extra days off from his surgical practice. Having them here, seeing Sarah's face light up when James told stories about her grandparents she'd never known, watching him beam with pride when she described a particularly challenging surgery, it felt like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "Mom, stop hovering and come help us," Sarah called from the living room. "Dad's trying to convince David to take up golf, and I need backup in explaining why that's a terrible idea." Dad. It had taken Sarah about 2 weeks to start calling James Dad, and the first time she'd done it, casually, in the middle of a phone conversation about his arthritis medication, he'd had to sit down and compose himself. Now it rolled off her tongue naturally, 40 years of missing relationship condensed into a simple word that meant everything. The life we'd built in Wilmington felt both completely new and oddly familiar. Our house was a modest 2-story near the beach, with a wraparound porch and enough bedrooms for family visits. James had thrown himself into retirement with surprising enthusiasm, joining a book club and volunteering at the local literacy center. I'd found a part-time job helping adult learners get their GEDs, work that felt meaningful without being overwhelming. We'd gotten married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse 3 months ago, with Sarah and David as witnesses and Emma and Grace as flower girls. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate, just 2 people in their 60s finally making the commitment they should have made at 18. Sarah had cried, James had forgotten his vows and had to improvise, and I'd worn a blue dress that brought out my eyes. "We should have done this 49 years ago," James had whispered during our first dance at the small reception we'd held in our backyard. "We couldn't have done this 49 years ago," I'd replied, looking around at our family, Sarah and David swaying together, Emma and Grace chasing fireflies, David's parents chatting with the neighbors we'd already befriended. We weren't ready for this 49 years ago. He'd been right, I'd realized. We'd needed those decades of separate experiences, of mistakes and growth, and learning who we were apart to become the people who could build this life together. The 18-year-olds who'd fallen in love in 1975 had been passionate and sincere, but they'd lacked the wisdom, the patience, the hard-earned understanding of what really mattered that made our second chance possible. "Grandma Maggie," Grace's voice pulled me back to the present. "Grandpa James says you make the best coffee in North Carolina, but I want to try some to see if it's true." "Coffee is for grown-ups," I said, moving to the stove to flip the pancakes James had abandoned in favor of chocolate chip distribution. "But I'll make you some chocolate milk that's almost as good." As I moved around the kitchen, our kitchen, in our house with our blended family, I felt the deep contentment of a life that had finally found its proper shape. Not the life I'd planned at 18, not the careful, controlled existence I'd built in California, but something richer and more complicated and infinitely more satisfying. James appeared beside me, slipping his arms around my waist from behind and kissing the side of my neck. "Happy?" he murmured. I leaned back against him, solid and warm and real, and watched our granddaughters argue over pancake toppings while our daughter and son-in-law planned a beach walk for later. Through the kitchen window, I could see the garden we'd planted together starting to bloom, the roses James had insisted on because he remembered they were my favorite. "Happy?" I confirmed, turning in his arms to kiss him properly, completely, impossibly, wonderfully happy. And for the first time in 49 years, I meant it entirely.